So tonight I'll be talking about the work that the Geological Survey of New South Wales has been doing to promote the state's geoheritage sites while ensuring their conservation and protection. I've been working on this project for pretty much the entire duration of my graduate program, and it's definitely become something of a passion project for me. There's obviously a lot to cover in this space, so I'll just try to give you a quick general overview of the project scope, the previous work completed in this space, and the methodology I've used for this project. I'll then follow this up with a more detailed look at how the data will be delivered in the future and what we're doing to ensure accessibility and the long-term implications of the project. But before we dive in, I'd like to get everyone to answer a quick poll. Bronwyn, if you could pop that up now, that'd be great. I'd just like to gauge how many of you have an idea of what geoheritage is. So hopefully you can all see that poll now. Yep. Just wait for a few more people. Cool, so wow, most of you know what geoheritage is, but a few of you have said that you only know a little bit or that you're new to this. So I'll just take a quick look at what geoheritage actually is for those of you who have answered no. So this is the formal definition of geoheritage, and I'm not going to try and read it all out because it is so long-winded. It's actually a bit full-on for my liking, but it does highlight that these features can range from local to national to global scales. Personally, I prefer a more simple definition. Geological places of outstanding scientific, educational, or historic value. Again, the scale of these features vary, and we have sites covering everything from geological formations and fossil locations to scenic landscapes and mining history. And the extent of these sites can range from small outcrops to entire national parks. We can also see this visually. This is the Geoheritage toolkit that the GSA uses to assess sites. Again, we can see that the features vary in size and form, which is this top part of the diagram here, and that the significance can vary from international to local, which is this bottom part here. I'm sure you all want to see some nice pictures, so I'll just run through some examples of different sites. So first we'll look at places of outstanding scientific value. This can include sites like the Seam Quarry, which achieve both national and international fame for the near-perfect preservation of varves shales. This site also has a considerable educational value and local historic value due to the association with Professor Edgeworth David. The Port Macquarie coastal section, which exposes a complete, albeit dismembered, ophiolite suite. This is highly important both scientifically and educationally, as it's frequently used for interpreting the geological evolution of the region based on current plate tectonic theories. And Wombo Quarry. Although this site has considerable educational value for the columnar jointing, dikes, and the sandstone latite contact, it also has international scientific significance. Samples from the quarry were among those used to define the Permian magnetic reversal, and were also used for paleomagnetic correlations around the world. Next, we'll look at places of outstanding historic and cultural value. First up, we have Broken Hill. I doubt there needs to be much of an introduction for this site, but it's highly significant for its impacts on European history in the state. Geologically, the site covers the remnants of the original Gossan and the line of lode. Culturally, there is the remaining chimney above the original BHP offices, and the structure above one of the original shafts, Brown Shaft. Indigenous history is also highlighted at sites like Lake Mungo. Contained within Mungo National Park, this is an incredibly important site for the First Nations people of the region. There have been significant findings of human and animal remains, including some of the oldest human remains on the continent and the oldest human cremation site in the world. Geologically, Lake Mungo is a fantastic site to study the Quaternary sediments and geomorphology, hosting features like the walls of China Lunette. The following places are examples of scenically important sites. Although the definition of geoheritage doesn't necessarily include scenic value, it's still an important consideration as these sites tend to be more attractive to tourists and consequently provide opportunities for public education. These sites generally have greater accessibility and amenities too. So places of outstanding scenic value include Fitzroy Falls. Apart from the spectacular views of the waterfalls and the high wilderness value of the area, the site also provides an extensive panorama of the southern Sydney Basin stratigraphy. With several walking tracks and multiple lookouts, Fitzroy Falls has excellent potential for public education on how the Sydney Basin formed. Just outside of Sydney, Newes was partly chosen for the proximity to the city. The landscape of the surrounding cliffline provides a scenic backdrop to the site's oil shale mining heritage. Newes also has a unique opportunity for public education by the way of a display explaining the mining significance in the early development of East Australian industry. The take home here for all of you is that although these sites can greatly differ in their significance, they help tell the story of our state's geology and should be preserved for future generations. Moving on now, the aims of this project were to collate and digitise the existing information we had on geoheritage sites. Creating a digital repository of the sites is important for a number of reasons. I'll talk about the origins of the state's geoheritage sites in a moment, but many of the sites were previously investigated for their geoheritage value and were nominated for inclusion on the Register of National Estate. That register has now been decommissioned, leaving most of the geoheritage sites without formal legislative protection. This is one of the reasons why it was incredibly important for us to collate and digitise these sites, because we can't protect the sites if we don't know where they are. A digital dataset also allows the sites to be stored together in one coherent database rather than scattered across multiple data sources. Once complete, the fully attributed database will be used for land use planning, site conservation and protection, as well as public education and geotourism. So as I mentioned before, this isn't really a new project per se, but rather the modern day continuation of one. It's been a long ongoing process to gain formal recognition and protection for many of the geoheritage sites in the state. We can actually trace the origins of the project back to the mid-1970s. So in 1974, the Committee of Inquiry into the National Estate sought and received submissions from specialist groups, such as the GSA, on the preservation and conservation of geological sites. The findings and recommendations of the committee, known as the Hope Report, resulted in the Australian Heritage Commission Act 1975. It was noted in the Hope Report that the Committee of Inquiry was surprised at the lack of official or public concern about the preservation of geological sites, with only 7 sites across Australia specifically and officially designated as geological reserves. There were no designated sites in New South Wales, although 3 sites, such as the Warrumbungle National Park, were essentially dedicated as geological monuments, but were not officially named as such. The committee recognised the scientific, educational and recreational importance of geological sites as signposts for the history of Australian landscape, and recommended that the Australian government finance a suitable scientific body or bodies to prepare an Australia-wide list of areas to be recommended for reservation as geological monuments. So the federal government actually followed this recommendation and did provide funding. The New South Wales Division of the GSA successfully applied and funds were administered through what was then known as the New South Wales Planning and Environment Commission. This led to the first detailed survey of places of geological significance in New South Wales and the resulting report written by Ian Percival, who I know we have in the audience with us tonight. From this, sites were nominated for inclusion on the Register of National Estate. So under the Australian Heritage Commission Act, National Estate was defined as those places being components of the natural environment of Australia or the cultural environment of Australia that have aesthetic, scientific or social significance or other special value for future generations as well as the present community. The natural environment specifically included special landforms, geological features, caves and areas of scientific interest. Over the next 12 years, the GSA helped obtain funding for a further 3 reports. So although some of the nominated sites were not successful in their application for inclusion on the register, many of the important sites did make the cut and were subsequently protected by the legislation. Later, new legislation would be enacted in place of the Australian Heritage Commission Act, splitting the natural environment and the cultural environment into 2 new legislative acts. This led to the creation of the National Heritage List and the Commonwealth Heritage List. Due to substantial overlap between these 2 new lists and the original register, the Register of National Estate was decommissioned in 2007. Unfortunately, the new heritage lists do not share the same scope of the Register of National Estate, and consequently, many of the geologically significant sites were not retained. It was thought that any of the sites that were not retained would be covered by state legislation, which brings us to now. Before I go any further though, I have another quick poll for you all. How many sites do you think there are in New South Wales? Are we able to get, yeah. So you should be able to see that poll now, hopefully. I agree, Phil. Ian Percival should be able to get this exactly, so we'll see. Okay, that's interesting. So the winner is 10 to 100 sites. For those 6 of you who have answered with more than 1,000, you would be closer to the truth. So there are around 1,500 sites across the state, many of which do not fall under any legislative protection. In addition to the 4 reports from the GSA, we've also compiled sites from a paleontology report, a comprehensive review of geologically significant places by Armstrong Osborne and others, and places identified on the geotourism map produced by Categorisation. My experience with this project has been a little bit like its history, a few twists and turns. When we first started the project, we set out to digitize the sites in the 4 original GSA reports. Designing the database template took a while because we wanted to ensure that we captured all of the necessary information and we wouldn't have to go through this process again later. The 4 GSA reports were scanned PDFs, and although they're good quality scans, it's not always the easiest way to get information. The biggest hurdle I found was the poor quality of the accompanying pictures. Sites were outlined on topographic inserts, such as this one here. But once they're scanned, they can become a bit of a jumbled mess and it's hard to make out the site extent. The old photographs didn't scan too well either, as you can see. I'm a very visual person, so this was really a barrier for me because I was really relying on the written descriptions to guide my comprehension of the site extents. Partway through capturing the sites, we became aware of the other data sources I mentioned earlier, the Cartoscope map, the paleontology report, and Osborne's Geoheritage report. We decided that these should be included as well, as they provided us with more information and the paleontology sites would need to be protected. Given the increased number of data sources and site locations, I had to reassess the way that I was capturing the locations. Digitizing the site extent and fully attributing each site is a slow process, and we had deadlines to meet for business requirements. The decision was made to start capturing the sites as points with minimal information. This meant I could significantly speed up the process, and although we didn't have detailed information for each site, we at least had a data set showing us where the sites were located. This preliminary data set is still useful for land use planning, as the assessors can request more information for a site if it falls within a planning proposal. And the survey's work in the geotourism space would benefit from this too, as clusters of sites can be identified, which can then inform areas with the potential for future geotrails. The paper reports still slow the process a bit due to the lack of clear spatial information. Thankfully, it got easier. Categorisation actually provides lats and longs for each site on their webpage, and Osborne's report had several shapefiles associated with it. The downside was that Osborne hadn't been able to locate all of the sites, and many of them were missing location data. After fixing as many of these as possible, I did a quality assurance check on the rest of the data set, just to ensure that the provided information was as accurate as possible. And earlier this year, I hit a milestone for the project and completed the quality assurance check. This means that the point data set is now finalized and ready to be used. So now I'm back to capturing the full site extent with detailed attributes. As you can see in this picture, I'm not only capturing information contained in the reports, but the land information for the site too, such as the land zoning and land tenure. This data set will serve as the final database product, and this additional information will be useful in identifying the sites which require more immediate attention, such as those sites which are outside Crown land. I'm also retaining the site sensitivity categories that Ian Percival implemented in the first report. The sites were assigned these categories to help determine the level of public access to a site and the level of management needed to properly conserve the site. By retaining the categorisation and implementing it on additional sites, we can make the data more useful and accessible to the public. I'm just going to briefly touch on how the categorisation works. So sites which are incredibly fragile or highly significant reference localities are designated as Category 1. Access to these sites should be prohibited for essential research purposes. Percival stated that these sites are comparable to Aboriginal sites, which have maximum protection under the National Parks and Wildlife Act. These sites should not be publicised, however, some are already widely known. In these cases, stringent protection measures should be implemented. Control and management of Category 1 sites would ideally fall to National Parks and Wildlife Service and be subject to regular inspection. Sites on private land that cannot be acquired by the state would be classified as protected geological areas or wildlife refuges under the National Parks and Wildlife Act. Percival suggested that entry into these sites would be restricted by a scientific permit system, with applications referred to the New South Wales Division of the GSA. Given the current purview of the Geological Survey, however, permit applications would now ideally be referred to them via National Parks and Wildlife Service. Specimen collection would not be allowed unless permission was granted via the permit, and controlled public access and publicity could be given to these sites, but only if on-site supervision and adequate physical protection can be maintained at all times to prevent site destruction. Reference and research sites fall under Category 2. So these sites are suitable for visits by research workers and small education groups under supervision. Minimal publicity should be made of these sites, with on-site protection measures to safeguard against misuse if they became more widely known. Many of these sites sit within nature reserves or wildlife refuges managed by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. However, several are under the jurisdiction of local governments or trusts. These organisations would need to ensure satisfactory preservation measures and monitor and control site use or give up their control of the land. Site access would vary, as access to sites on wildlife refuges will be at the discretion of the landholder, as they fall on private land. As such, each site would have to be considered separately in regard to specimen collecting. One possible solution Percival saw for this was a permit system similar to Category 1 sites. And Category 3 sites are open access. They generally have educational and scientific importance, but are also of interest to the public as well. As such, they should have widespread publicity via brochures and signposts. Percival recognised that these sites cover a variety of land uses and were managed by different organisations. As responsibility for the sites would not be able to really be done by any one body, steps would have to be taken in establishing a common theme of geological site conservation. He believed that this could be achieved through uniform signposting of the sites. Specimen collecting will vary between sites, with specimen collecting being restricted on sites that are within national parks. Percival also suggested that nose boards may be necessary to discourage visitors from collecting if the site is more vulnerable to destruction. So as you can see, the categorisation helps us identify sites that require greater protection and conservation measures due to their rarity and or vulnerability. Although Category 1 and 2 sites will not be made publicly available, they will be recorded in the internal database where we can use them for land use planning purposes. Given their sensitivity, we don't want to be losing these sites to future developments. Please keep in mind the categorisation was originally seen as an end goal for the first part of the project. However, with the decommissioning of the Register of National Estate, many of the sites do not actually enjoy the level of protection outlined in each category. Without the final data set, these sites have the potential to be lost to land development. So some of the measures in the categorisation will also need to be modernised as legislation has changed and technology now allows for greater dissemination of information. You might be wondering how we can make our geoheritage more accessible to everyone if there are so many protection measures in place. The good news is that most of the sites fall into Category 3 and are therefore open access. Based on the work that I've done fully attributing the data set, we estimate that around 70% of the sites will be classified as Category 3. One of the goals is to have all publicly accessible sites delivered through our online mapping portal, MinView. As this is a while off, this picture is just to give you a bit of an idea of what that may look like. The plan is to have a polygon data set that can be selected to show all of the necessary information relating to that site. So once selected, you would see a window like this pop up and all of the attribute information for that site would be there. If the site falls within a geotrail, the information would reflect that and provide a link to our geotrail webpage and or app. The point dataset will also be available in MinView, so you can see specific locations that are contained within the whole geoheritage site. For us, geotourism is really important as it helps promote geology and the earth sciences. Additionally, it helps educate people on their immediate environment and how it came to be. Many people enjoy some aspects of our natural environments, such as the flora and fauna, without really understanding how the geology is a significant factor in forming that environment. Greater public education can only be a positive, especially if people can learn to understand and appreciate the basics of geology. It would also seek to benefit industry, although mining interests are often thought to be at odds with conservation. Greater public understanding of geology would likely have flow-on effects into the industry sphere. And with greater knowledge around why mines exist in certain places and the importance of mining in the modern day, industry would likely see an increase in social license for mining activities. This concept was even acknowledged in the Hope Report back in the 1970s, where they noted the possibility that mining interests would wish to help preserve significant geological sites. Additionally, some geoheritage sites fall within disused quarries, and while the quarry face may be visually unappealing at first, they often expose high-quality cross-sections with great educational and scientific significance. As geologists, we're generally less adverse to seeing mining practices continuing in or near significant geological sites, providing that those activities lead to the continued exposure of those features. Access to some of the old quarry sites can be difficult, however, mainly due to safety concerns. So where to next? First things first, a lot more of this. The final dataset needs to be finished. I'm currently continuing this work on capturing and attributing the sites, and I hope to have this finished later this year. Once completed, the dataset will be moved into our internal database system, and the publicly accessible sites will be made available via MinView. And we can start sowing the seeds for education and geotourism. We have a lot more work ahead of us to ensure that the data is delivered in the best format. But once we have the fully functioning database, we can work with other parts of state government and local governments to ensure each site is properly recognised and protected. As I previously said, there is a certain urgency to this work to ensure the sites are not lost. This urgency stems from the number of sites that have already been lost or are currently under threat, particularly in urbanised areas. While it's unfortunate, it is a reality check that a lack of knowledge or concern for geoheritage has resulted in lost or destroyed sites. This can be as simple as a road cutting being covered in shotcrete material to stop traffic hazards, or more complicated, such as the vandalism of paleontological sites, such as middens. A good example of a lost site is the Greenacre Dyke, which was originally investigated as part of the first Geoheritage report. Extending across a brick pit in the Bankstown area, the rippled surface of the dike was considered to have great educational importance. It was noted in the report that the pit was due to be backfilled once operations finished, and the environmental impact studies apparently gave little to no regard of the geological significance of the dike. This photo is taken from Google Maps, and we can see that there is now an industrial area over the site. Other sites have had near misses, one of the more recent and notable examples being the Hornsby Quarry. The operations for the North Connects tunnel needed somewhere to dump the rubble, and the abandoned quarry seemed like the best solution. Unfortunately, the quarry hosts the Hornsby Diatreme, which is the largest and best exposure of this geological feature in the Sydney region. The site has considerable scientific and educational merit, as well as being of public interest. The original Geoheritage report noted that the local council and state government should be made aware of its significance to stop the site being lost once operations ceased. Now, I don't know if they were notified about the feature previously, but following the announcement that the quarry would be infilled, the GSA made submissions to the local government to try and preserve the site. These submissions turned out to be critical, as most of the rubble has since been sent to another location, and the site will now become a parkland instead, with the diatreme wall forming a prominent feature, which is this yellow line around the outside. And as you can see, there are several viewing platforms and vantage points, which will actually look onto the quarry wall. And now for the even better news. The survey, along with other interest groups, have been working to set up geotrails in various places around the state. Many of you may have already heard about our geotrails and the New South Wales Geotours app, and if not, I highly recommend you check them out. Both the Port Macquarie and Newcastle coastal geotrails make for a beautiful walk while enjoying some of the amazing geology of the area. And for those of you who may be stuck at home, you can even enjoy our virtual tour of the Newcastle Geotrail. While this Geoheritage project hasn't been a direct influence on the existing trails, the Newcastle and Port Macquarie trails were selected as geoheritage sites in the original GSA report, highlighting that geotrails and geotourism as a whole are a good way to share our geoheritage with people. The database will also help form the basis of many new trails which are already in the pipeline, such as the Warrumbungle National Park geotrails. We want people to be out there visiting these sites, and the geotrails are a great way to experience a part of the larger story. So what are you waiting for? Thanks.